Hello everyone and welcome to my studio. Karen Margulis here with another new video for you this month. And today we're going to actually solve three potential problems, or really work on three different things. Number one, we're going to try a brand new paper. At least it's new to me and maybe new to some of you. Pastelgrain paper. We'll talk more about that. We are also going to do a wet underpainting. We're going to do a wet wash using water and pastel on Pastelgrain. And third, we are going to try to take a green landscape with a lot of green and try to make it a little bit more interesting. So three things we're going to solve. So what I want to do is invite you closer to the easel so that we can get started. I do want to say one thing though. I would love to share more with you, and if you enjoy this video, of course, subscribe. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe to this channel, or you can join me, and you can join me over on the Patreon. I'll put the link below so that you can get more videos, more lessons, and a really great community. All right, come closer to the easel and we'll get started. All right, let's take a look at what we'll be working on today. I'm going to be painting a landscape. This is a foggy day in Maine on the coast, so we have some rocks and a variety of trees and bushes, but it's very green and kind of dull, right? So how can we pump this up and make it more exciting? Well, one way we can do that is by considering what colors we can put in the very first layer, or the underpainting. And I've decided that I want to do a wet wash. Now normally we would call it an alcohol wash because we would use rubbing alcohol. I'm going to use water today, and we'll see what effects we get with the water and the pastel. Before I start the painting though, I always like to do a very quick value-based thumbnail where I simplify my subject into just a few big simple shapes, and I assign them a value, and I usually like to keep things 4 or less. So in other words, what are the dark shapes, where's the lightest shape, and what is in between? And so you can see in the value thumbnail that I have done that, and I will actually use this value thumbnail and not the photo to start the painting. Now I'm going to be working on Pastelgrain. This is white. Now Pastelgrain is made by is the same company as Pastel Matte paper, which is Clairefontaine. And if you've used Pastel Matte, then you know that it's very absorbent, almost like a sponge, and it just grabs onto your pastel. And while it does take a wet underpainting, it just soaks it up like a sponge. So we're going to see if the same thing happens with Pastelgrain. Pastelgrain, and it's really hard to tell in this video, but it has a little bit of a rougher surface. Pastel Matte is completely smooth. It feels the same. It's on the same type of thick, heavyweight card, but there's just a slight amount of texture. So we'll see how that affects the pastel layers. But we're going to first begin with the underpainting, and I'm going to just take a pencil, and not looking at my photo, I'm going to simply look at my underpainting, and I'm going to just block in the shapes that I see in my underpainting. Now oftentimes I will actually remove the photo from my view, because what happens for me is I tend to just look at the photo, and before I know it, I'm drawing every leaf and every tree and every bush, and I get carried away. So if I don't have the photo in front of me, then I tend to be able to be a little bit more expressive and painterly. So I just put in these big shapes very loosely. And now I'm going to take Nupastels, which is a brand of a harder pastel stick, and I'm actually, let me see if I can just hold these up for you. I've selected 4, a dark one and 2 in the middle, and a very light one of the color red violet. Now why red violet? Well, I am looking at a scene that has a lot of green, so that I know from experience that if I incorporate and anything in the, say, red or orange family with my greens, then you're introducing the complement, and it just is a lot more interesting. That's one reason for the red violet. The second reason for the red violet is I want to kind of capture that foggy, moody day kind of feeling. And I know that the red violet works really well to kind of give me that that feeling. Now I'm going to block in the lightest areas, which happens to be the sky. Now notice in my reference photo, the sky is completely, almost white, very, very, very pale blue, but it's almost white because it was a foggy day. So I really do want to capture that foggy day feeling. Now, what is left? Well, we have the rock shapes and the grass. I'm actually going to make the rock shape slightly darker than the sky. And then everything else is going to be this darker middle value, and all these grassy areas. There are also some trees that are kind of in the distance, so let's just block those in so that we can get a better feeling of depth going. And I'm going to actually do one thing. I'm going to darken. I'm going to take the dark back out and darken the side of the rock, kind of attach it to our foreground shape so that it doesn't feel like it's floating. So this is my very first layer. Now, I can just rub it in with any kind of blending tool because I want to get rid of the white of the paper. But like Pastel Matte, it seems like we're going to need to have a lot more layers in place before it starts blending easily. So that seems to be the same with Pastelgrain. I'm also noticing a line that's fortunately right in the middle of my tree, but this is, I probably maybe scratched or dented the paper. So I've used this paper a few times before, and I do notice that if you make indentations in the paper, it will show up, right? So it really does. You do have to be a little bit careful of the paper. Now, is this going to matter? No, in the grand scheme of things, we are not going to have to worry about it. We're going to cover it up. Now, I'm going to use water. You can liquefy your pastel with any wet medium. Water, rubbing alcohol, mineral spirits, anything that you can use to liquefy it. I'm going to start with the lightest values first, and I'm not going to have things too wet and drippy because one thing that I noticed on the previous paintings that I've done on this paper, Pastelgrain, is that it does, while it takes the wet underpainting, it did buckle slightly. If I used too much liquid, like if I was too generous with my liquid, it did dry flat, but I wasn't able to work on it right away. I had to let it dry and flatten. And in fact, on one piece, I had to put it underneath some heavy books. And then it dried perfectly flat. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now you might think, well, why don't you use the rubbing alcohol? Because maybe it will dry faster and you won't have that issue. I still had the issue, so I really wanted to try water once again. And again, I'm just trying to, I'm using a paper towel to dab my brush. Oh, let me talk about my brush. This is a Princeton children's paintbrush. You can see it's really well worn because sanded papers will tend to be hard on your brushes. So I like to use inexpensive bristle brushes. I have the best luck with them, and I like to really scrub the paint in, or the pastel in once it's wet, as you can see. The other thing that I noticed on Pastelgrain, and you can probably see it here, is that it really does suck up the water or the liquid, and it doesn't move the pastel around very readily. It's like a sponge. If you were to do the same underpainting on another paper, such as UArt paper, I like to use sanded paper, Lux Archival sanded paper, typically what would happen when you get it wet is that it would drip, and you would get interesting drips and dribbles and kind of fun things to respond to. But just like pastel matte, the pastel grain really does grab this liquid, and it soaks in and it really doesn't drip. Okay, so that's important to know, because if you are looking for a surface where you can get a wet underpainting, where you get some interesting things happening, just know that this is not the surface for you. So why would I bother to wet it? Well, a couple of reasons. Since I'm working on the white paper, I don't want the white to peek through, right? Because then I end up adding too much pastel. So basically I'm toning the paper with a value-based and color underpainting, and now it'll be easy to start building color on top of this once it dries. If I didn't do this and I'm working strictly on white paper, I would be fighting that white paper. Now, pastel grain though does come in other colors, and I've just placed an order so that I can try out other colors of the paper. In that case, you wouldn't necessarily have to do a full underpainting like this. But we're going to let this dry, and hopefully it's not going to buckle. Oh, I should mention I have tape hinges using artist tape on all four corners. I really need to put one in the middle. You see where it's popping up? And I'll do that. We'll let it dry, and then we'll come back and we'll start adding pastel. Alright, the underpainting is dried, so I just thought I would show you the pastel palette that I've selected for the painting. And basically this is just an assortment of pastels. Most of them are Terry Ludwig. There's some Diane Townsend in there. I'm not sure what this big one is, but it's just a variety. And what I like to do is pre-select a palette before every painting. And what happens is oftentimes within a painting month, I will keep the same tray and add to it or take things away, and that way I have a very limited palette. I'm not relying on all the pastels that I have that I own. It's just too many and it's overwhelming, so keep it limited, and that really helps. So now let's take a look at our dry underpainting, and I wanted to point out that when this painting dried, it did buckle slightly, so that it was a little bit wavy. In fact, it still is a little bit wavy. Then when it was dry, I put it under some heavy books, and it did flatten out somewhat, but some of the waves are still visible. And what I noticed is when I used this paper before, this is pastel grain, it did better with the rubbing alcohol. And it does better when you don't get it super wet, which is something I already discussed. But yeah, so it is a little bit sensitive to the water, but it's still flat enough that I can paint. So I'm going to go ahead, and the first thing that I'm going to do is go into the painting and reinforce the dark areas. So anywhere that there's dark, I'm going to reinforce it, and I'm going to create several layers of dark before I move on. Well, I'm going to start with a dark blue, and I'm looking at my photos, so no longer do I have to just look only at the little thumbnail. I'm actually looking at the photo, and while I don't want to feel as though I'm copying the photo exactly, I want the photo to just kind of inspire me, kind of bring me back to this place and time. Oftentimes I will look at the photo to give me that inspiration, and I try to remind myself, don't copy it. You know, you want to make this scene your own. And sometimes though, you take a photo and it actually ends up being a fairly decent composition, and then it becomes an even better guide. I'm kind of thinking a lot lately about using reference photos and how to use them more effectively. I'm going to be actually doing some workshops with that topic this spring, 2025. So yeah, it's been on my mind. quite a bit. So I've got the 3 main trees blocked in with a dark blue. This happens to be, I'm pretty sure that, I'm positive, this is a Rembrandt pastel. So it's a harder pastel. It doesn't deposit quite as many layers. Quite as much pigment, rather. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's good for those first layers. But basically, at this stage of a painting, I'm really just selecting the pastels that are the right color and value for what I want to do. Alright, so now I've blocked in all of the darks with that dark blue, and I'm going to create another layer of dark. This time I'm going to just go with a dark violet. And this is a softer pastel. This is a Terry Ludwig. And you can see that I have to use a light touch because it's soft. It's depositing more pastel than the Rembrandt did. And my goal here is I don't want to fill the tooth of the paper too quickly because I really want to have several layers. Makes for a more interesting painting. So I'm basically just going over those the same blue. Now I'm going to do yet another layer of dark. This time let's do a dark, let's see, let's do a dark reddish brown. This is more brown than I wanted. I'm going to just add a little bit of it. Just add a little bit of warm. This is actually a bush in front of the tree, so we'll start separating them out. One thing now I'm adding a dark blue-green. One thing that I'm keeping in mind as I'm building up these layers is that I want to keep things simple for as long as I can. So notice that I'm not painting leaves, or I did a couple of individual branches on these trees, on the 2 end trees, because they are very spindly and bare. But everything else, notice I'm leaving it pretty simple, no detail. Now I'm going in with some more green. This is a dark, kind of a grayish green. I'm going to leave this one more blue-green because it's behind this one. So, and this is so tall. And we've got this big bush here that's in front of the tree. So let's start to pull it out. Basically the idea is you put these things, these big simple shapes in the beginning, and then you gradually carve into them and start creating more detail, more clarity. The next thing that I typically do once I have all the darks in place is work on the lights. In this case it would be the sky. But before I can do the sky, I want to establish another layer behind the trees, because if I look at my photo just for ideas, I see that there are some bushes and even some distant trees that are in the distance. Oops. And that will give me a chance to create a better feeling of depth in this painting. So this is a blue-green, a little bit lighter value than what I've already put down. So I'm using it to establish some trees that are in the distance. And one of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm using the pastel to do some negative painting to break up the tree shapes to make them a little bit more interesting. Let's see. I want to add a little bit more green, I think, to that side. And in the very distance, I can see there's little hints of some of those evergreen trees in the distance. So I'm using an even lighter bluish gray just to kind of poke those in. I might do that over here as well. This is where it's, you take out your artistic license and you see how you might move beyond what's in the photo to get a better painting. And anytime I can create more depth, I like to take advantage of that. This is a nice gray blue that can get another distant layer in there. All right, now that I have established that, I'm going to go ahead and paint my sky now. This was an overcast, you know, the fog was kind of moving out, so it's not a really clear blue sky day. So I'm going to create what I like to call a fractured sky. And basically what I'm doing is I'm going to take a few different pastels that are going to be close in value, so fairly light, and I'm going to layer them on top of one another. I'm starting with a pale blue, and also I'm carving into my tree shapes at this point so that I can get interesting silhouettes on the trees. So just continue with this light blue. And no, remember we had that pink in our underpainting, and notice I'm not covering it up completely. I want that pink to kind of peek through. And let's go with another layer of a light value. This is a pale purple. And just a light touch. So what do I mean by a light touch? I can still see the layers underneath what I have already put down. If I couldn't see it anymore, then that would be what I like to call a shouting touch. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you want to make sure you're shouting when you're ready to shout. And what I'm going to do is one more layer. I could do more. Maybe let's do another. Here's another purple, but this is more, a little more of a reddish kind of feel to it. So I don't want to put it everywhere. I'm going to just put it in a few places. And then I'm going to use a pale yellow in the very lower portions. And I have to pull it up into the sky a little bit so that I don't have, I don't want it to be too even. I need a smooth transition. That's the word I'm looking for. And I'm going to sneak that sky down into the trees here. Oops. Again, looking at my photo just to give me ideas. Make sure that's an interesting silhouette there. I think the sky goes down pretty low. These bushes are a little more spindly. Give it a little more character. Alright, so that's it for the sky. And I may or may not come back to it. It might be enough. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle, and I'm going to use it as a workable fixative, and I'm going to give it a very light spray on all these dark areas. Now if you spray too much, it's going to get too wet and things will start dripping, but I have just enough spray that will make those darks kind of stay in place so that when I come back over it, I will get a little bit more texture and the darks will remain dark. And I used to use a workable fixative called Blair, very low odor. If you've been followed me or you've seen me paint before, you might remember that, but it's no longer manufactured. So unfortunately I've had to find alternatives, and so using the rubbing alcohol has been kind of my go-to. What I'm doing now is I'm adding some color. So we have some grasses and we have some rock shapes. So I want to add another layer of color where the grasses are and where the rock is, so that I can have a little bit more interesting color. Not just go right with the green and the golden grasses. So let's make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm using some kind of gray, mauve-y colors. Let's see, what else can I put in there? I'm gonna put in a little bit of this is nice big yellow ochre, just to add a little bit of color to the grassy areas. The rock, let's see, Now, because I have pre-selected the pastels, meaning, you know, I'm basically using what I have in my tray for other paintings, you know, you might say, oh, well, you know, I could really use another blue, or I could really use a darker green. There's no reason why you can't dip into your tray, or, you know, your boxes of pastel and pull out what you need. I like to pre-select just so that I can stay in control, but it doesn't mean that I am restricted. I just pulled out another dark, I think this is a really super dark blue, and I just want to darken that even more, and I think I'm going to do this before I move on. I'm going to take out what I like to call a super dark pastel, and in this case it happens to be a Terry Ludwig eggplant. V100 is the number, and notice how much darker it is than the darkest areas that I've used, right? So I'm using it as to create accents. So at the base of the rocks, and especially in this foreground area. I don't want to use it any further into the painting, so like basically up where the tree line is, because then everything would be flat. So I'm using the super dark. I don't want to use it everywhere, or it will lose its impact. Alright, now that I've done that, I'm going to add a little bit of color to these rocks with a nice reddish brown. These rocks are going to take several layers of color. Let's make them a little bit lighter and grayer in here. This nice putty color. There's a few little random rocks in here as well. One thing that I have to remind myself, I'm going to add a little bit of a blue-gray to the rocks. One thing that I have to remind myself when I'm painting is not to get stuck in any one area. It can be the downfall of a painting, because, and it happens, you know, it can happen quite often. I'm looking for, yeah, this peachy color. In other words, I get stuck on these rocks and I think, oh, that's not right, that's not the right color, let's add more, I'm not getting it, and then you get frustrated and you keep fussing over one particular area, and then before you know it, you've completely overworked that area and you ignored the whole entire rest of your painting. So I like to remind myself, if I feel like I'm getting stuck in any one area, to continue the painting and move on. So I'm going to do that with the rocks, okay? I'm not done with the rocks, but I find that I'm, you know, spending too much time on those rocks. Okay, so fine, so I'm going to move on. And it makes sense to move on and get a little bit more done with these trees. It's also important, this is a nice dark green, it's also important to occasionally remind yourself of what was important to you in the painting. What was your story? Was it about the rocks, or was it about the trees? You know, that's where you want to spend the most time once you've figured that out. And sometimes we lose sight of what our story is, and then when that happens, the painting loses its impact. I'm trying to pull out this bushy area here, and it's kind of, I'm going to add a little bit of a warmer green and break it up a little bit. There is so much that I want to share with you, and we can't put it all in one single demo, right? So basically, whenever I do a demo, I try to just kind of narrate what's going on in my mind, like what am I thinking of as I paint, and that's the way I like to share my demos with you. So I can't get it all out in one single demo. So really, I invite you to consider joining our group over on Patreon. I'm going to put the link in the description of the video, but there's a new video well, 2 videos per week, plus lessons and so much more. And it really gives me the opportunity to share even more with you. Let's see, this tree here is more of a blue-green tree. Let's add that blue-green. And I'm starting to refine my marks, right, so that I can have more of a interesting mark making to kind of capture the character of the tree. And now that I have that in place, I'm going to go ahead and work on some of these grassy areas, and then I'm going to kind of finish up the rocks. So I'm introducing some of the green. I am not concerned about having the painting finished all the way to the edges. In fact, one of the things that I like to do in a painting, because I'm trying to paint with more expression, I want to suggest detail rather than put every single detail in. I want the viewer to participate in the painting and kind of fill in the details. So I have to stay aware and remind myself that I don't want to have every detail in this scene. Okay, I like that kind of golden yellow grasses that are sticking up here. But also notice at this stage, I like how it's kind of sticking out over here. I still have not put in a lot, if not any, detail. But I'm getting to that stage. And so what happens when I get to that stage is I slow down. So up until this point, I call this the passion part of a painting. When I'm just painting and I'm really trying to think about kind of letting the marks in the pastel fly. I'm not really thinking so much about every single mark and where the viewer is looking. I just want to get layers of pastel onto the painting. But then I get to this stage where I am at right now, where I need to slow down. And I call that the thinking part of the painting. And when I slow down, I think about where I want to have the detail and where I want to have a little more finesse, right? And so what I like to do at this stage is give it a quick spray of the workable fixative or rubbing alcohol, because I'm going to add like another layer, but this time this layer is going to be more refining. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take time, step back, work on it just a little bit more, and then I'll come back and finish the painting. Alright, so the alcohol spray has dried, and I came back in and I tried to figure out in the slow down phase what I wanted to happen. And basically I want this rock to kind of lead us over to the trees and then kind of back around, you know, so I want this to kind of pull us into the painting. So I'm going to do a couple things. I've made a few marks just to kind of feel my way around. But what I want to do is start to refine some of the tree shapes and some of the rock shape, and I'm going to be switching to some harder pastel. So this is a Nupastels brand, hard pastel, so that I can get some kind of finer line and detail. This happens to be black, but really any dark value will work. I'm trying to get some of the just hints at some of the little branches and things. A little bit more finer detail in here. And when I'm in this slow down phase, you know, obviously it's going to take me a little bit longer to work my way through things, and oftentimes I will write down the things that I want to do to address the painting to help me finish the painting, and then I have a little bit of a kind of checklist to follow. And the other thing that I like to do is continually step back and evaluate things. Make a few marks and I'll step back and evaluate things. But here's where I'm starting to get a little bit more detailed with some linear marks. Put some linear marks in the rock. We've got this nice crack in here. There's some cracks in here. And then some of the grass is growing up over it. One thing about rocks, we could do a whole lesson on rocks too, is that we don't want them to look like potatoes, right? We don't want them to look mushy. So I try to keep using straight lines and angles so that I can really make them feel a little more solid. The other thing that I'm going to do, besides introducing the harder pastels, I'm actually going to also introduce some softer pastels. So I'm going to introduce some Sennelier. Oops, that broke. Oh, another thing that I do at the very end of a painting is I start shouting, right? So up until this point, I've been very mindful of using a light touch, but then at this stage, I really like to push harder on the pastel so that those harder, what I like to call shouting marks, provide a nice contrast to these softer, lighter marks that I've previously made. But I'm going to introduce some softer pastels because they allow me to really get nice shouting marks. So we can really push them in and they're nice and soft and give me a nice contrast with the lighter touch marks. Let's see, I want to have, so I keep this set, this, there's Sennelier half stick Paris set is the set that I like to use. And I just keep it by my easel and I tend to pull it out towards the end of the painting for those finishing marks. But usually up until that point, I mostly use Terry Ludwig and some Diane Townsend. I also enjoy using those. Actually, there's not very many pastels that I don't like or that I don't find a use for, which is always fun. I'm going to add another hint of a rock back in there. Notice you can hear my easel board popping. That's because I'm shouting at this stage. This is the fun part. This rock shape is not all that interesting right now. I think I need to, this comes up a little bit higher. And this is where sometimes it does help to have a look at the photo. I'm going to pull that up a little bit higher and change it. Change the shape. It's too potato-like. We don't want that. Okay, so then the other thing that I'm going to do is come in and get some of those little grassy areas, kind of up over the edges of the rocks. There's some up here at the top of the rocks. Also, you can use the harder pastel sticks for that. I have to remember that I'm working on a surface or paper that I have not used very often. Probably this might be my third or fourth painting on this surface, this Pastelgrain. So whenever you're using a new to you surface, it always takes a few paintings till you get the hang of it and you kind of get to know its strengths and its weaknesses. So I always kind of give myself a little grace when I'm working on a new surface. And in my early days of painting, I would say that if I found a surface that I didn't really enjoy, I would say, oh, I don't like it, and I'd give up on it, right? And I have learned that it's oftentimes not that I didn't like it, I just didn't know what that paper was good for. I didn't know how to use it. So if you ever find yourself saying, I don't like that paper, I'm never going to use it, go back to it after a while and say, you know what, let's see, I've grown as an artist, I have more experience, let me try it again. Because I love a variety of papers because it gives me, different effects. Different papers are good for various subjects. So I'm just kind of working my way through. I'm looking and I see that I kind of have a bluish shadow along the edge. I'm going to add a little more blue to these rocks. in here. Just a little more blue, and I think a little bit darker in there. And we're getting to that stage where, you know, I may or may not be finished, but I always like to leave the painting on the easel a day or so, or maybe even overnight, and that really gives me a chance to revisit it and make sure that I haven't missed anything, or fresh eyes will always kind of give me more information. So I think I'm at that stage in this painting, and I really hope that you have enjoyed the demo. I hope you've enjoyed seeing that wet underpainting, trying a new paper. I really do enjoy Pastelgrain because you do get some texture because of the pastel, or because of the texture in the paper, but the nice thing about it is that it does not eat up your pastels. So, you know, some papers are very textured, and, you know, it's distressing to see your pastels getting smaller and smaller because the paper's so rough, and I find that I don't have that problem with this paper. So will I use it some more? Yes, most definitely. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you stuck with me till the end, thank you so much. Join me over on Patreon. I'm going to try to do a YouTube video at least once a month, hopefully more. But if you want more, please join us over on Patreon. We'd love to have you. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, and let's go paint.